The inheritance of the 200-acre farmland was both a blessing and a mystery for the protagonist. Their grandfather, Joe Miller, had always been a proud and private man, fiercely protective of his land. When he passed away, the protagonist found themselves unexpectedly thrust into a world of rural life, legal documents, and unforeseen battles. The land had been in the family for generations, with rolling fields, dense tree lines, and a small but sturdy farmhouse that had stood the test of time. But before they could even settle into their new reality, a shocking revelation disrupted their plans. Mrs. Thompson, a longtime neighbor, delivered unsettling news. The Sunny Pines Homeowners Association, HOA, had already begun construction on what they claimed was their own property. The protagonist was baffled. How could 96 luxury homes be rising on land that had just been legally transferred to them? Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, they began digging through their grandfather's records, unaware that they were about to unearth a decades-old deception. Driven by confusion and suspicion, the protagonist scoured through stacks of documents inside the old farmhouse. Their grandfather, a meticulous record-keeper, had left behind a collection of property surveys, legal papers, and journal entries detailing his concerns about land ownership. As they studied the old maps and deeds, a startling truth emerged. The land extended far beyond the boundaries that had been legally recorded in recent years. It wasn't just a small discrepancy, it was an 80-acre deception. Someone had deliberately altered the property lines in 1997, slicing away a significant portion of the farm. The fraudulent changes meant that nearly half of their inheritance had been stolen on paper, paving the way for the HOA's illegal development. With their heart pounding, the protagonist realized they weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting against an elaborate scheme that had been set in motion decades ago. But who was behind it, and how deep did the corruption run? Determined to stop the unlawful construction before it was too late, the protagonist wasted no time in seeking legal counsel. They found an ally in Walter Franklin, a sharp and experienced lawyer who specialized in property disputes. Walter's reaction upon reviewing the documents was a mixture of shock and outrage. He confirmed that the fraudulent boundary changes were not only illegal but could also nullify the HOA's entire development plan. Together, they quickly filed for an emergency injunction to halt all construction activities. The legal battle had begun. When the court ruled in their favor, ordering an immediate stop to construction, the HOA erupted with fury. Diane Reynolds, the ruthless and power-hungry HOA president, made her first direct move against the protagonist. She wasn't going to let decades of deception be undone so easily. As soon as the court order took effect, the real war began, not just in the courtroom, but in the everyday life of the protagonist. The HOA, led by Diane Reynolds, responded with relentless aggression. It started with minor inconveniences, mysterious utility shutoffs, unexpected fines for non-existent infractions, and road access being blocked without warning. But as the protagonist stood their ground, the attacks escalated. Power and water were cut off entirely, forcing them to rely on generators and rainwater collection. The road leading to their farmhouse was suddenly closed for repairs, making it nearly impossible to receive supplies. Anonymous complaints were filed against them, accusing them of violating obscure zoning laws. But the protagonist wasn't alone in their struggle. Other homeowners within Sunny Pines began coming forward, revealing that they too had been bullied, fined, and threatened by the HOA for years. The oppression they had silently endured had finally reached a tipping point, and the protagonist's fight was becoming a rallying cry. With a growing group of allies, they formed the Meadowcreek Homeowners Coalition, a united front against the corruption that had plagued their community for too long. Tensions rose. An unexpected ally emerged, Gerald Fisher, the HOA's treasurer. Gerald had been uneasy about Diane Reynolds' leadership for years, but had never spoken out for fear of retaliation. However, with the growing resistance movement, he saw an opportunity to finally expose the truth. Late one evening, he met with the protagonist in secret, bringing with him a thick folder of financial records. Inside was proof of widespread fraud. Funds that were supposed to maintain the community were being funneled into private accounts linked to Diane's family members. HOA dues had been misappropriated for years, funding luxury vacations, personal renovations, and illegal kickbacks. This revelation was a game-changer. Not only had Diane stolen land, but she had also been stealing money from the very homeowners she was supposed to protect. Armed with undeniable proof of financial crimes, the protagonist and their coalition prepared for their next big move, a town hall meeting where the truth would be laid bare for the entire community to see. The town hall meeting was unlike anything the Sunny Pines community had ever seen. The usually controlled and staged affairs, where Diane Reynolds dictated every decision, were now turned into an open forum of rebellion. Word had spread fast. Homeowners who had long feared retaliation gathered in record numbers, fueled by frustration and newfound hope. The protagonists stood before the packed room, armed with documents, surveys, and financial records that exposed the full extent of the fraud. One by one, they laid out the truth: the fraudulent boundary changes, the illegal construction, and the embezzlement of HOA funds. Gasps echoed as Gerald Fisher, the HOA treasurer turned whistleblower, took the floor and detailed how Diane had funneled money into personal accounts under the guise of community improvement projects. Diane, usually composed and domineering, was visibly shaken, but she still fought back, calling the accusations baseless conspiracies designed to undermine progress. However, when Walter Franklin, the protagonist's lawyer, presented irrefutable evidence of bank transactions and forged signatures, the tide completely turned. The once intimidated residents now demanded accountability, and Diane found herself cornered with no allies left to defend her. Knowing her control was slipping, Diane made a desperate move. She filed a countersuit, claiming the protagonist was inciting unrest and endangering the community. Her legal team, well funded from years of embezzlement, attempted to bury the protagonist in lawsuits, hoping to drain their resources and force them to settle. But the protagonist refused to back down. With the evidence of fraud and illegal land seizure now public, the case gained attention beyond the local community. News outlets picked up the story, and environmental groups became involved after it was revealed that protected wetlands were part of the disputed land. Federal agencies launched investigations into the HOA's finances, and the pressure on Diane reached a breaking point. Meanwhile, construction on the luxury homes had halted completely, leaving half-built structures as eerie reminders of the corruption that had fueled the project. Homebuyers who had already invested in the development now demanded refunds, adding more legal and financial strain on the HOA. Every move Diane made to regain control only tightened the noose around her, and it became clear that her reign was coming to an end. As the evidence against Diane and the HOA board mounted, federal investigators uncovered even more damning proof: wire fraud, tax evasion, and falsified contracts connected to the illegal land grab. Faced with overwhelming charges, Diane had no choice but to take a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she agreed to step down as HOA president, admit to financial misconduct, and cooperate with authorities in recovering stolen funds. The once feared tyrant of Sunny Pines was now disgraced, stripped of her power, and facing years of legal battles. With Diane gone, the remaining HOA board members scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, but their credibility had been completely shattered. The court voided the fraudulent boundary changes, restoring the protagonist's rightful ownership of the full 200 acres. Homeowners, once divided by fear and manipulation, began to unite under a new vision, one that prioritized fairness, sustainability, and community-driven decision-making. The oppressive HOA regime had collapsed, but the work of rebuilding a better community was just beginning. With the legal battle finally over, the protagonists turned their focus to the land itself. The wetlands, once at risk of destruction, were now officially protected under federal environmental laws. Working alongside conservationists, the protagonist established walking trails, educational signs, and viewing platforms to highlight the area's natural beauty. But the biggest transformation came with the farmhouse, which had stood as a silent witness to generations of struggle and resilience. Instead of keeping it as a private residence, the protagonist chose to convert it into a community center, a space where residents could gather, learn, and reconnect. A new name was chosen, the Meadowcreek Center, honoring both the land's history and the coalition that had fought to protect it. The farmhouse, once a battleground, now became a symbol of unity. Old rivalries faded, replaced by a shared mission to create a thriving, balanced community. Even former HOA supporters, once blinded by Diane's influence, found themselves embracing the new direction. The protagonist didn't stop at legal victories and land restoration. They envisioned a self-sustaining community that thrived without greed and corruption. Plans were set in motion to redesign the stalled development into an environmentally friendly neighborhood. The half-built luxury homes, once symbols of excess and dishonesty, were reimagined with solar panels, energy-efficient designs, and shared green spaces. Instead of high HOA fees and rigid rules, the new community was built on cooperation and mutual benefit. A community garden was established, allowing residents to grow fresh produce and reconnect with the land. With the wetland area preserved, local schools partnered with the protagonist to create educational programs about conservation. And in the heart of it all, the Meadowcreek Center became the pulse of the neighborhood, hosting workshops, town halls, and social events. The protagonist's grandfather had fought to protect this land decades ago, and now his legacy lived on, not just in the preserved acres, but in the people who had come together to reclaim their home from corruption and rebuild it with purpose. As the protagonists settled into their restored home and the community began to heal, they stumbled upon something unexpected: an old leather-bound journal buried deep in a chest in the attic. It was their grandfather's personal journal, filled with handwritten notes, sketches of the land, and accounts of battles he had fought decades earlier. The entries revealed that Joe Miller had spent years fending off land developers and corrupt officials who had tried to seize his property under false pretenses. He had documented every attempt, every lawsuit, and every underhanded tactic used to strip him of what was rightfully his. But more importantly, the journal contained letters to the protagonist, words of wisdom and encouragement, as if Joe had somehow known that they would one day face a similar fight. Reading those pages, the protagonist felt a deep connection to their grandfather, realizing that their battle had not just been about land, it had been about honoring a legacy of resilience and justice. The journal became a treasured artifact, a reminder that the land had always been worth fighting for. With the land secured and the HOA's corruption dismantled, the protagonist wanted to give the community something tangible, a symbol of growth, renewal, and unity. Inspired by their grandfather's deep connection to the earth, they spearheaded the creation of a large community garden, inviting residents to reclaim the soil that had once been at the center of so much conflict. The garden quickly became a focal point of the neighborhood, where families worked side by side, planting fruits, vegetables, and flowers. Elders shared gardening wisdom with younger generations, and former rivals found themselves laughing together as they tilled the land. The once divided community had transformed into a place of shared purpose and cooperation. The protagonist couldn't help but smile as they watched neighbors who had once feared the HOA's oppression now freely exchanging seeds and ideas. The garden was more than just a source of food, it was a declaration that the community belonged to the people, not to corporations or corrupt leaders. Determined to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, the protagonist championed a new initiative, integrating sustainable energy solutions into the redesigned development. Instead of relying on outdated infrastructure, they worked with environmental experts to install solar panels on every home, making the community nearly self-sufficient in energy. Residents who had once been burdened by the HOA's endless fees now found themselves paying lower utility costs and reaping the benefits of clean energy. The initiative extended beyond just solar power. Rainwater collection systems were installed, community composting programs were introduced, and native plant landscaping replaced wasteful, chemically treated lawns. The new neighborhood, once planned as a soulless luxury development, had become a model for sustainable living. The protagonist knew their grandfather would have been proud to see the land being used in a way that respected nature rather than exploiting it. Despite stepping down from her position, Diane Reynolds had not yet faced the full consequences of her actions. Investigators continued to dig into her financial records, and it wasn't long before additional fraud charges surfaced. Her plea deal had saved her from a lengthy prison sentence, but it couldn't protect her from the full weight of civil lawsuits that followed. Homeowners she had extorted for years began filing claims against her, seeking damages for the financial and emotional toll of her rule. Diane, once the most powerful figure in the community, now found herself isolated, bankrupt, and disgraced. The once feared woman who had controlled every aspect of Sunny Pines was now reduced to a cautionary tale. When she finally left town, no one mourned her departure. The protagonist knew that while Diane was gone, the real victory was not in her downfall. It was in the strength of the community that had risen up to reclaim their home. With Diane out of the picture and the fraudulent land claims voided, the protagonist and their allies finally won their long legal battle. The court's final ruling not only restored the rightful boundaries of the land, but also set a legal precedent that prevented similar fraudulent land grabs in the future. Homeowners who had been trapped under the HOA's oppressive rule were now free to govern themselves fairly, without the constant fear of arbitrary fines and retaliation. The Meadowcreek Homeowners Coalition officially replaced the former HOA, rewriting the community's rules to prioritize fairness, environmental protection, and resident involvement. As the protagonists stood before the gathered homeowners, now united in a way they had never been before, they realized that this victory was about more than just a lawsuit. It was about proving that justice, community, and perseverance could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Their grandfather's legacy had been honored, the land had been protected, and the future was now theirs to shape. With the legal battles behind them, The protagonists turned their attention to ensuring the land would remain protected for generations to come. Partnering with local conservation groups and government agencies, they secured official recognition of the wetlands as a protected ecological zone. This designation meant that no future development could threaten the fragile ecosystem that had once been at risk. Walking trails were carefully designed to allow people to appreciate the area's beauty without disturbing its natural balance. Informational signs were placed along the paths, educating visitors about the importance of wetland conservation and the unique wildlife that thrived there. It was a fitting tribute to their grandfather, who had fought so hard to protect the land in his lifetime. Standing on the edge of the water, watching birds soar above the marshes, the protagonist felt a deep sense of peace. This land would never be taken again. The transformation of the farmhouse into the Meadowcreek Center quickly became one of the most meaningful projects the protagonist undertook. What had once been a private home filled with history was now a communal space filled with laughter, learning, and connection. The main hall was converted into a gathering place where residents held town meetings, workshops, and celebrations. A library was established with books on farming, sustainability, and local history, many of which had been donated by longtime residents. The walls were lined with old photographs of the land, including snapshots of Joe Miller, a testament to his enduring legacy. As the community embraced the center, it became a beacon of what was possible when people came together, not just to fight corruption but to build something better in its place. The protagonist quickly realized that the struggle against the HOA had not just been about money or land, it had also divided families and friendships. Some residents had supported Diane out of fear, while others had fought back in silence, waiting for the right moment to take a stand. Now that the battle was over, there was room for reconciliation. The community garden and Meadowcreek Center became places where old grudges melted away. Neighbors who had once avoided each other worked side by side, planting seeds and sharing meals. Families that had been torn apart by HOA disputes mended their relationships, realizing that they had been pawns in Diane's game. The protagonist made it a point to reach out to everyone, ensuring that no one was left behind in the rebuilding of the community. Forgiveness and unity became the foundation of their new HOA. To mark the end of an era and the beginning of something new, the community organized a grand celebration. The Meadow Creek Festival, as it came to be known, was held on the newly protected land, bringing together residents, conservationists, and even local officials who had supported the protagonist's efforts. Live music filled the air, children played in open fields, and families gathered to share homemade meals. A ceremonial ribbon-cutting at the Meadowcreek Center symbolized the official transition from a corrupt HOA-controlled community to a self-governed, resident-led neighborhood. The protagonist, standing before the crowd, gave a heartfelt speech about resilience, justice, and the power of standing together against wrongdoing. As the sun set over the land their grandfather had fought so hard to protect, they knew that this was just the beginning of a new and better future. As the years passed, the changes the protagonist had fought for continued to shape the community in ways they had never imagined. The wetlands flourished, the Meadow Creek Center became a pillar of the town, and the once divided residents found strength in their unity. The redesigned housing development, now built with sustainability and inclusivity in mind, became a model for other communities seeking to balance progress with environmental responsibility. The protagonist knew that they had not just won a legal battle, they had helped build something that would last beyond their lifetime. Every time they walked through the garden, watched the solar panels powering homes, or heard children laughing in the community center, they felt the presence of their grandfather, his legacy living on in every blade of grass and every person who called Meadow Creek home.